The Dark Towers of Nianzvht.
High in the bell tower of Nianzvt Castle, Falson lurked in the darkness as the last of the raider mob stampeded away towards the setting sun. He stayed in the shadows ruminating on how dismally prepared he was for Damarie's return, and how short-sighted he'd been when he first witnessed her display of technique and ability. How stupid he'd been when he discovered her skulking far outside the walls of the castle for not suspecting more. She was far more worthy of an adversary than he'd imagined. Still, he wondered if there was a way to salvage his plans to usurp the throne. As he considered every conceivable option, his thoughts focused on Shayla. Perhaps she was the key to this. It was evident that Damarie's primary reason for obliterating the raiders and rescuing the kingdom had everything to do with Shayla, and little to do with the Kaelin or the kingdom itself. Folsom wondered how true the legend of the promise could be. Perhaps the utter nonsense of it all meant that he could further manipulate the mythos if he found a way to set in motion the perfect adversary and opponent. Whatever that equation came to be, Folsom was confident that Shayla would be caught in the middle. Morning rose over the eviscerated house of Nianzvht. Pyres of smoldering homes and barns were scattered across nearby villages as wafting smoke and embers floated in the sky. Villagers, townspeople, servants, warriors, and nobles gathered en masse after spending the night packing whatever remained of their disheveled belongings. The morning was reserved for burying the dead, and there was a roving funeral procession, moving from cottage to cottage paying respects to the fallen heroes of Nianzvht. Inside the crumbling walls of the House of Nianzvht, there was a more private funeral in process. Tanar watched as pallbearers carried King Nation's body to a large funeral pyre. The king was set atop the kindling and Zan lit the base. The small gathering of people watched until the entire pyre and the king were engulfed in flames. Tanar watched the flames stoically. He was immovable, even as pallbearers and castle servants raced over in tears and tossed black lilies into the flames. Zan took his place by Tanar's side and laid a heavy hand on his shoulder. "My father is gone," Tanar nodded, trying to keep his composure. "My home is destroyed. You are the only family I have left, though no one could blame you or stop you if you decided to leave."
"I shall be exactly where I belong," Zan interrupted. "At your side."
A few moments of silence passed and Zan sensed there was something more that Tanar wanted to say. Indeed, there was something more Zan needed to say to Tanar at the right moment. "The villages are nearly packed, my lord," Zan began. "At sunrise tomorrow we will travel north to Aija Marafik to gather more supplies, and then we travel east."
"The House of Nianzvht has fought against raiders," Tanar began. "A war-minded cousin, and the deception of a woman. I cannot leave this god-forsaken place soon enough."
Tanar meandered away, consumed by his thoughts, and Zan felt his opportunity to counsel the young king slipping away.
"Tanar," he said in a fatherly way, "King Nation had love in his voice when he spoke to the woman. As angry as you were, you also displayed love in your voice. That matter is behind me." Tanar waved it off. "It shall be forgotten. In a lifetime." He continued walking away. Zan called out to him again, but this time his tone was firm.
"The cloaked one did indeed ride to Nianzvht." He beckoned. "Hearing our king's affection for her, I sent the steward after her to protect her. My lord, she needed no such protection."
"The steward said she fought like a tigress to defend Nianzvht against the raiders. She repelled their attack, but her reward for saving the kingdom was condemnation."
Tanar recoiled as if struck in the gut. "What are you saying to me, Zan?" he demanded. "She will be executed at dusk, my lord." Tanar reeled from the pang, slamming the inside of his chest, and fell to his knees. "Gods, what have I done? I confessed my love for her, and then I forsook her, in a most horrible fashion, a mere hour later. How am I any different from the mad king of Nianzvht? We have surely angered the gods, and they punish us with chaos." "Within that chaos stands a woman who would rather die than have you believe she betrayed you," Zan reminded Tanar. "What a precious gift, my lord." Zan's words struck a chord in Tanar's heart. He spun towards his captain, beaming with delight. "What a precious gift," Tanner repeated. "My father said those very words to me." He paced in a tight circle in front of Zan, and then he grabbed his captain by the shoulders. "Zan, I need you to lead our people away. There is something I must do. If I am successful, I will gather with you at Isha Marafik. If not, you must care for our people in a manner no less fitting than that of a lord." Tanner didn't wait for a response. He was running towards his waiting Pinto before Zan could utter a word. Eolin, Hee-young, Hua-jong and Hyo-son gathered around Shayla in the queen's bedchamber as Mieko, overwhelmed with worry, paced in winding circles around them. She marched and fidgeted and twirled her hair repeatedly. Something had upset her, and thoughts did not rest comfortably in her mind. After a few laps around the chamber, Shayla became too annoyed to remain quiet. "Calm yourself, Mieko," she demanded. "This is the only way." Eolin reluctantly nodded her agreement. "He is an honorable man, Mieko," she added, sounding as if she were trying to convince herself as well. Mieko glared at the two of them. "He has also served the king for 3 decenniums. Do you think it wise to consider him an ally?" Her tone was challenging and sarcastic. There was a soft rap on the door. Shayla brushed her tunic smoothly and opened the door without looking. Safford stepped in and immediately felt the uncomfortable heat of the women's distrusting gaze. Shayla shut the door behind him. She started to motion for Safford to sit, but she stopped. She knew that out of respect he would never sit in her presence if she were standing. Shayla looked Safford in the eyes and held his hand. "Safford, you have always been a reasonable and enlightened man. Thus I pray you see the truth in my words. The king has lost all reason. I fear for my children and my maids." "My lady," Safford started, "forgive my interruption, but you said children. What does that mean for Lady Damori?" "Safford," Shayla continued as she moved closer so that only Safford could hear her whisper, "Damori is the child who filled my belly many years ago when you found me in the Black Wildwood. Do you remember?" Safford's voice was as low as a whisper as he said, "One and the same." Shayla looked first at the other women in the room who were oblivious to her conversation, then she turned her focus back to Safford and nodded. "Yes," she affirmed, "one and the same." Safford fell to one knee. It was not an act of fealty, but one of overwhelm. The realization of Damori being hidden and mistreated for so many years hurt his spirit. He was speechless, and Shayla for a moment thought her last hope had evaded her. "Safford, I cannot keep my children or my maids safe. I need your help to protect my family from the king." She said it plainly, leaving no room to misunderstand exactly what she was asking of Safford. Safford slowly stood. The women anxiously awaited his response. Some tapped their feet. Eolin hugged herself. Shayla expected him to struggle with her request. She knew that treason was no small malfeasance, especially in the eyes of King Kaelin. She was asking Safford to risk his life. Perhaps he was not ready to do so, she thought. Then she kneeled at Safford's feet, as she had done to King Kaelin many times in her life. "I pray to you, Honorable Safford," she begged, "please help my family." Safford took Shayla's hand and guided her upright again. "Pardon my delay, my lady," he said, looking into her eyes reassuringly. "I am not at odds with your request. I began planning your escape the moment you asked me. I shall assist your endeavor." He knelt at her feet and drew his sword. "My sword and my life are eternally yours, Empress Shayla." Shayla embraced him with all her might and cried into his shoulder. Mieko and Eolin joined in as well. When they stopped hugging and sobbing, Shayla took Safford's hand again. "Take Mieko, Eolin, and my maids to the safety of the Camilchan Valley." "What of your escape?" he questioned, seeing an obvious hole in her plans. "If the king knows Mieko is gone, he will take your head," he reminded her. "Perhaps if we free Damori, she can lend her skills to aid your escape." Shayla shook her head. "You witnessed her submission to the king exactly as I did. She will never defend herself against him. She loves him." Safford looked at each of the women, hoping to enlist their support before he turned to Shayla. "If you stay, you will die," he said matter-of-factly.
The women lowered their heads. They were not surprised by his statement or by Shayla's refusal to heed his warning. "My fate is already written. Take my family to safety. I will free Damori. She and I will join you in the Camelchin Valley."
Kaelin sat brooding menacingly over his throne in what was left of the great room. Blood still pooled in cracks in the brick and followed a trail of grout. Kaelin was oblivious to the mess and the stench of death as he stared off into the distance. His attention was caught in some dark abyss in his mind, and he couldn't hear Folson approach.
"My lord," Folson began proudly, "I bring word that Nation's kingdom has fallen. Your enemy is defeated." "A king has many enemies." Kaelin's apathetic reaction surprised Folson. He tried to rebound and stifle his disgust with Kaelin's pathetic, pouting demeanor.
"Wise words, my lord." Then he decided it was time to push his true agenda. For an empire to endure, the king must cleanse the kingdom of treason and treachery. Folson was unaware that the sound of his voice annoyed Kaelin until the king flagrantly waved him away.
"You babble on, regurgitating what I already know. A king must be grander than a legend, I know this."
Kaelin jumped to his feet and kicked over his throne.
"When the sun falls, so shall the sword upon Damori's neck. Blood of my blood will be spilled this day."
"It is a difficult choice, my lord, but what are your plans for Shayla?"
Kaelin glowered at Folson with pure hatred in his eyes.
"Shayla has taken what belonged to me. Honor, respect, obedience. She took it. You ask me about Shayla? What choice does a king have when confronted by a usurper?"
Safford was accompanied by 3 guards as he escorted Mieko, Ilin, and the triplets on horseback across the plains of the Camelchin Valley. The sun was still high in the sky, although it was well past noon. The horses trotted at a moderate pace at a perfect heading of due south. The group managed to abscond without incident with all they required neatly tucked away in sacks tied to their saddles. As far as Eolin was concerned, luck had been on their side the entire trip. Now, she prayed, if only the same luck would rain down on Shayla and Damari, they could put their past behind them and start anew, wherever they decided to call home. Still, Mieko was uneasy. She was sulking and she kept checking the direction of the sun and the moon. Finally, when she realized the sun was behind and over her right shoulder, she stopped her horse and looked back at the Safford. "I believe you are lost, Sir Safford," she said plainly. "Though it was against the order of my father, I have travelled to Camelchin many times. We should be going west. Why are we going south?" Safford kept his horse moving. "We take a detour. There is an important stop we must make first." Mieko snapped the reins and her horse sped up to a trot running alongside Safford. "My mother, the queen, gave strict orders." Safford didn't slow down. He kept his eyes forward and kept moving. "Princess, I am afraid I must delay the queen's command. There is something I must show you first." He snapped his fingers twice to signal his guards. 2 warriors moved to either side of Mieko. Neither looked at her. A 3rd guard moved to the front and grabbed her horse's reins. Mieko had nowhere to go. Mieko shot a terribly disappointed look at Safford. "Captain Safford, am I not free to go as I please?" Again, Safford refused to look her in the eye. "Let us ride on, princess." He snapped his horse's reins, and the group pressed on at a faster pace. Mieko looked at Eolin as if to say, "I told you so." There were 2 towers that stretched high above the keep at Nianzvht Castle. The west tower overlooked the castle grounds and gave a clear perspective across the valley to the closest to launch the 2nd wave of the raider incursion. The east tower, however, served as a dungeon for prisoners. The east tower was a dark, dank, and dismal place. Because it was exposed to the elements, it was susceptible to flooding when the heavy rains came. There were cracks in the walls that leaked when the upper levels failed to drain. This caused an incessant dripping sound that made prisoners go mad. Because the east tower was situated deep within the walls of Nianzvht, it was patrolled by a single guard. He routinely moved from a secured location at the base of the east tower to the uppermost level. The top level was akin to death row. It was where prisoners were sent who were sentenced to death.
As a result of the battle with the raiders, and due to relatively slim pickings, the guard assigned to watch over the keep tower was an inexperienced young man barely 16 years old. 2 days prior, he would have been seen working in a henhouse snatching eggs from watchful mothers. Today he was told he'd be assigned to watch over the most notorious enemy of freedom the men and women had ever known. Damori. As the young guard followed his assigned route up and down the tower, a lone man dressed in a cloak and hood moved behind him. The man tiptoed after the guard, following him up the tower's spiral staircase like a shadow. When the guard reached the next level and turned right, the mysterious figure turned left and slipped into a corridor unseen. When the guard continued down the corridor, the mysterious figure ascended the steps to the top floor and ducked into a dark corner. After listening for a moment to ancient echoes in the dank corridor, the mysterious figure stepped out of the shadows and removed his hood. A nearby torch illuminated his face. It was Tanner. Tanner waited until he was sure no one else occupied the corridor before he moved slowly down the hall. He stopped at a narrow staircase against the wall that rose to the highest level in the tower. The stairs were perilously thin, and he cursed the builders who created such an inaccessible holding cell for criminals. He hesitated a moment as he considered what and who might be above. He hadn't a clue where he was going in the tower, and it was possible the prize he sought was above. After several moments of mental deliberations, he started towards the stairs. Suddenly, a shiny dagger was held firmly against his throat by an unseen figure behind him. The person had been hiding in the darkness all along. Tanner froze, but he was undeterred. "Coward!" he spat. "Drop your knife and draw your sword like a man!" Shayla stepped out of the shadows but kept the knife at his throat. "But I am no man!" she corrected him. "So why in heaven's name would I do that?" Tanner was thrown off guard by her soft but firm, feminine voice. "Who are you?" Tanner demanded. "I am the woman with a dagger against your throat," Shayla declared with angry desperation. "Thus it is I who shall ask the questions." She pressed the dagger harder against his neck. A minuscule amount of additional pressure, and she would have drawn blood. "Why do you lurk? There is but one person detained in this tower." Shayla snatched Tanner's sword out of his sheath and pushed him away. Now she confidently held 2 weapons. It would be difficult for any man to best her if she carried a weapon in each hand. She had surprise on her side. Most men severely underestimated her ability to fight. She stood ready for Tanner, but he made no move against her. He stared at her and cocked his head to the side, frowning as he searched his brain. Finally, his mouth dropped and he uttered a staccato gasp. "Empress Shayla?" He squinted in the dark to confirm his recognition. "Do I know you?" "I am Prince Tanner." She sized him up. "Are you King Nianzvht's petulant boy? You have grown. Why are you here?" Tanner suddenly remembered his dire mission and grimaced to show his contempt for Shayla. He stepped forward proudly and pointed an accusing finger. "I come to free Damori from the likes of you, you who condemn her to hide her precious face." Shayla was stunned by his proud admission. Her breath caught and her bosom trembled as she inhaled. She didn't believe it yet. She searched his eyes for signs of deceit but saw none. She felt herself becoming increasingly incredulous with every second, but the truth was, before her stood a man who had risked his life to sneak into Nianzvht and free her daughter. Still, she had to be sure. "Her precious face?" she posed. Tanner nodded as his eyes flashed with memories of his time with Damori. Her skin, her color, and her blessing of heavenly design she wears on either temple. It was what Shayla needed to hear, to confirm Tanner had indeed laid eyes on Damori. She studied him for a moment, and then she snatched his hand and pulled him away with her. She pulled him into an empty cell. There was a foul odor inside and dark stains on the wall. Shayla realized she never knew what went on in the dungeons. She had no idea how humane or inhumane the treatment of criminals was, how utterly poor of her to preside over the kingdom as queen but never look the prisoners her husband's warriors captured in the eyes. She pulled Tanner into a corner and put her hand over his mouth. Outside the cell, a guard passed by. This guard was not the young, immature boy who allowed Tanner to sneak in. This was a big brute of a man with battle scars on his arms and shoulders. If he discovered them, Shayla and Tana would surely be dead, she thought.
After the hulk of a man had passed, Tana removed Shayla's hand from his mouth.
"Why do you hide here? I must free Damori."
Shayla placed her sword against his belly. His blind commitment was becoming foolish and annoying.
"Lower your voice or I will skewer you," she reprimanded. She paced as she pieced it together.
Now it all makes sense. King Nation trained Damori in twisting dagger. How perfectly like him. It is through his sweet kindness and love that my kingdom was saved.
Tanner was surprised by the fondness in Shayla's voice when she spoke of his father. She could see his confusion in his eyes. She softly laid her hand upon his and smiled at him. It was the smile that had broken as many hearts as it had reassured. "Nation and I grew up together. We were close until I was betrothed to Kaelin." She caught herself digging up old memories of Nation. "Did your father send you?" she asked, still smiling. "My lady, raiders attacked my kingdom. My father defended it, but he now rules in the afterlife." The smile on her lips immediately withered away. Shayla nodded. It was all she could do. Nation was dead, and she felt something inside of her die too. She had long since given up on caring for anyone as much as she cared for Nashyan. As well, she'd put aside her feelings for him as was proper. But the thought of not being there for Nasian during his last moments was unbearable. Especially when he'd taken such great care of Damori, made Shayla immensely sad. Finally, after a moment of silence, she looked up at Tanner and smiled again.
"So," she said, teasingly, "Nation trained my daughter, but it is you who stole her heart." Tanner beamed, and then he drew back in surprise. "Your daughter!" He spat in disbelief. "Your daughter! How?" Shayla took his hand again. "That does not matter now. Tell me, do you care for my child?"
"With all that I am. I love her," he said without blinking. She slid his sword back in his sheath.
"Just before the sun falls, you must take her far from here and never return."
"What about you?" he said. For some reason he could not explain, he felt a sense of dread. "My fate is already sealed," she stated plainly as she led him out of the cell. A rustic cottage-like farmhouse stood in the midst of hundreds of acres of farmland in the Kamailchin Valley. The house stood beside a stone barn surrounded by a wide circular fence. Inside the fence, countless chickens, several goats and 3 cows meandered freely. They were guarded by 3 vigilant collies that stood watch inside the fence. The sun had already begun its descent as Safford, Mieko, Eolin, 3 guards, and the triplets arrived on horseback at the pagoda by the farm's entrance. One of the collies casually glanced over at Safford, then returned its attention to the flock inside the fence. Safford led the group to the farmhouse and dismounted. Behind him, Mieko, Eolin, and the triplets also dismounted. The guards spread out on their horses facing outbound, watching the distance for anyone who might approach. Mieko wandered for a bit, taking note of the meticulously maintained farmland, the healthy crops, and happy, well-adjusted animals. There was no room for servants in the cottage, so Mieko knew that whoever maintained this farm was personally committed to its success. "Whose land is this?" she demanded. "It belongs to me, my lady," Safford happily replied. "It was given to me by King Kaelin many years ago." Mieko couldn't hide her astonishment. She spun and looked at Safford with a new sense of wonder and respect. "A farm?" she questioned, still filled with awe. "Such pristine condition. I cannot imagine you in the fields, with a plough."
"Pushing ploughs is easier on the soul than wielding swords, my lady."
Mieko nodded her agreement, but she remembered the guards. She surveyed the area and noticed the warriors perched atop their horses looking outbound.
"Why am I here, Safford?" she demanded with full royal arrogance. "Do you intend to do me harm?"
Safford offered a disarming smile that momentarily embarrassed Mieko for her question. His smile was disarming because she couldn't remember the last time she'd seen Safford smile. Suddenly she realized he wasn't smiling at her. He was looking at someone behind her. She quickly spun around, ready to defend herself when she saw Luli standing at the doorway to the farmhouse. Luli's jaw dropped, and her eyes were wide with shock and wonder. Mieko stared at the woman as if some distant memory had caught her and refused to let go. Eventually it did, and Mieko attributed the momentary familiarity with a common face. What Mieko didn't notice is the gawking expressions on the triplets and the guards who compared her facial features to Luli. To them, there was no reason in the world why two women should look so much alike, unless they were related. Luli rushed to wipe her hands on the apron around her waist and ran to Mieko. She wrapped her arms around the princess and kissed both her cheeks. Mieko didn't know what to do with the strange woman who was obviously smitten with her. She reached up and tentatively patted Luli's shoulder as she shot a look at Safford for assistance. He offered none. "I dared to hope I would someday see you again," Luli exclaimed. She released her embrace but held tight to Mieko's shoulders so she could look into her eyes and examine her face. "My," she continued, "how exquisitely beautiful you are." Mieko shrugged. "Thank you, that is very kind, miss." "This is my wife, Luli." Safford interjected. "Princess, I brought you here so you could learn the truth. There has been far too much deception and too many secrets in Nianzvht."
"What truth could there be for me in this place?" Mieko questioned. "Princess Mieko," Safford began, "Luli is your true mother." Mieko snatched her arms away from Luli's grasp. "How dare you!" she shouted. "Your humor is in poor taste and even more poor timing as my mother faces an unknown peril in Nianzvht." She turned to Luli and wagged a finger at her. "I would expect that as a woman, you would have more sensitivity to such matters." Luli wanted to touch her daughter again, but she rightfully assumed diplomacy might be the better path. "The queen has loved you from the moment you were placed in her arms. But it is I who gave birth to you." "Liar!" Mieko screamed. Even as the words rang in the air, she felt a sense of the untruth she'd just spoken. She turned to Iolin and the triplets for support, but the expressions on their faces made it clear to Mieko that they'd already bought into this charade. Their eyes were wide and kept shifting from Mieko to Luli. Still, Mieko's heart belonged to Shayla, and she imagined that any acceptance of what Luli said was tantamount to the highest level of betrayal to her mother. "I swear to you, Mieko," Luli softly reassured her. Mieko turned to Safford, her eyes pleading for him to admit he was lying. "How can this be?" she calculated. "I've heard the stories of my mother's sleepwalk into the Black Wildwood before giving birth to me." She turned to Iolin, still pleading. Iolin looked away. Of course she knew the truth, but she had no idea Safford would unveil it in such an unsophisticated way. "Iolin, you have personally told me these stories, if for no other reason than to assure me that I was the special one to whom my mother gave birth after that fateful event." Safford approached Mieko and laid hands upon her shoulders. His touch was father-like and reassuring. "Many years ago the king commanded me to take you away from Luli and end her life," he explained. "It is the only order I ever disobeyed." "He kept me hidden in his farm for many years," Luli added, "and we fell in love." Luli caressed Safford's cheek and kissed him. Iolin came forward and took Mieko's hand. "Princess Mieko, I do not agree with the manner in which Captain Safford has revealed these things," Iolin clarified as she glowered at Safford. "However," she added, "I can attest to the truth of his words. I was there, Princess. Empress Shayla did not give birth to you. This I know to be true." "Look at her face, Princess. Her eyes are yours. Her features are yours." The triplets added in unison. Mieko looked back at the triplets and the guards. All were nodding. The resemblance was remarkable and uncanny. Mieko felt obligated to search for the truth. She reached for Luli's face and stared into her eyes. "I see myself in your eyes," she finally admitted. But there was more uncertainty than ever in her voice as she looked at Iolin. "Iolin? If Empress Shayla did not give birth to me, whom did she bear?" All were silent. The triplets lowered their eyes. The guards stared at Iolin, hungry for the truth. "She had a beautiful brown baby girl," Iolin finally admitted.
The words echoed in Mieko's mind, repeating over and over, becoming unintelligibly muffled, then crystal clear. Her world followed with the air turning cloudy and grey, then ramping up to a mind-blowing high contrast of yellows and reds. Her vision became a frantic swirling whirlpool of blue sky, green grass, charcoal earth, and amber people blending together at alternating high and low speeds. Her head bobbled, her legs buckled like stalks of wheat under a plough's cutting graze. She wobbled and teetered, further and further, until her angle was so extreme that Safford reached out. He caught Mieko as she fainted,